Let's continue this. This is second video on same topic: impact and history of budget deficit and debt. Uh, looking especially at the case uh, looking at the case of the U.S. history, especially. And let's start from the history of deficit financing and debt in the U.S. So, in 19th century, we had. Well, actually, it's not 19th century. It's 18th century, I think. Yeah, I forgot when U.S. was founded. It was 17 something or 18 something. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was 7. Yeah, it was. So it was 18th century. The United States was founded. It got independence from the Britain, and the history of deficit in the U.S. actually started as it fought against Great Britain. Okay, so Congress issues bonds to fight against Great Britain in independence, right? Probably the Congress in the America didn't have enough tax revenue to make weapons and fight against Great Britain. So what they did was they borrowed from those wealthy people who produce more than what they consume. So it was possible for them to defeat Great Britain and make the United States of America. And the War of 1812 also involved borrowing of money. National debt approached 15% of its GDP. This was fight against Great Britain, and I think they won. And they also had civil war, right? The Confederate got independence. There was divide over slavery, and the U.S. Issued will borrowed a lot of money, so national debt approached to 40% of GDP, and they were able to win this war. And generally, after these surge in uh, debt happens, they decline after this war, right? Because they were able to make budget surplus, and budget surplus was norm uh, before 1931, 29. Yeah, so in this period, right, like 18th century and 19th century, budget surplus was norm. So even when debt surges, sometimes they were able to suppress it after that emergency period, which sounds healthy, I guess. After learning the problems of um, budget deficit, it depends, but yeah. And early 20th century. Let's look at early 20th century. Oops. Okay, no. Okay, so U.S. fought another war, which was World War One. U.S. joined World War One, taking place in Europe, and national debt surged to 40% of U.S. GDP. Very, very significant. And Great Depression also happened. Remember, when recession happens, tax revenue shrinks. Right? It's very easy to imagine. Economic activity slows down. Economy is not producing as much as goods and services than before. Therefore, tax revenue falls as a result. And President Franklin D. Roosevelt initiated New Deal policies to combat this by expanding transfer payment, and also starting a lot of government projects to make dams, make infrastructures, and things like that. So tax revenue shrank, and spending and government outlay expanded. That increased deficit spending. Okay, that increased budget deficit by a lot. And during World War II, deficit also increased. The U.S. decided to fight against Germany and Japan, the fascists and Nazis. They needed a lot of money to do that. Okay, and consumer goods were rationed, so many people bought war bonds. So the government was able to uh, get a lot of funding fairly easily because a lot of people were restricted from buying consumer goods, so they just ended up buying bonds, right? So a lot of people were giving up consumption. That's what's happening. It kind of shows how the redirection of resources, redistribution or reallocation of resources rather than a creation of wealth, right? This is the best example. The U.S. was producing so much military by getting a lot of fundings. However, people's living standard during World War II was very low. People were not buying cars. People were not going luxury shopping. People were not eating a lot of food. People were not going to restaurants and eat fancy steak. People were not traveling different states to enjoy their vacation. They were not doing that. Um, and that allowed the U.S. government to use that remaining resources to make this military um, project possible and beat the fascists. They made nuclear weapons. They made what else? Like they made tanks. They made food necessary for soldiers. They paid for soldiers, things like that. And obviously, debt rose during this period, and it rose all the way until 122% of GDP when World War II ended. As a result of all these things, I guess. So deficit became the norm in since 1931. Okay, so after this period, budget surplus was like like a rare thing. Okay, so the government was constantly paying more and spending more than what they were collecting as tax. So they were constantly borrowing money, which is fair. And let's actually look at data because it's really interesting. This is a federal surplus or deficit as percentage of GDP. So yeah, as we can, this starts from I think 1930, right? So right after the beginning of Great Depression to 20 all the way until 2025. It's constantly negative, meaning that government outlays and well, tax revenue was below government outlays. Sometimes we have surplus. Here, right, when World War II started, well, when the U.S. joined World War II because Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, I think. Yeah, we see a significant surge in budget deficit, right? And budget deficit is also quite large during the period of uh, uh, economic contraction, the Great Depression, right? So that's what happened. We can also look at gross federal debt as percent of gross domestic product. Uh, See, after the beginning of World War II or Pacific War or U.S. joining World War II, the debt as percent of GDP has surged, and it declined a bit later. Okay. Remember that the decline of debt as percentage of GDP is possible without running on budget surplus. They don't need surplus, budget surplus to decline to reduce debt as percentage of GDP. Because if GDP is growing, the debt as percentage of GDP by definition has to decline. In order to decrease the absolute value of national debt, yes, they do need to run on budget surplus. So make sure you know that distinction. Okay, so deficit became norm. Just know that. Okay, so let's move on to late 20th century. Okay, until 1980, debt declined as percentage of GDP consistently. Let's look at this. Right, decline until 1980, and it started surging. And who was president? It was Ronald Reagan, who served as President of the United States of America from 1981 until 1989 January. So he signed Economic Recovery Act, which cut income tax and also corporate tax. So right, so he advocated this idea of supply side economics. He argued that you know rich people are the one, or people who are running business who tend to be rich. They're the one who knows how to make investment. They're the one who knows how to make, uh, you know, very productive, smart decisions on like where to allocate the money. So therefore, we should cut tax. We shouldn't collect money from those rich people. So the rich people will retain more money, so they can make investment. They can make factories. They can do all these investments. So that will create jobs. That will lead to surge in people's income. Trickle down would happen. That was his opinion. Therefore, he did pass. The Congress passed this bill, and he signed this act, which did a significant tax cut. Uh, as a result, it didn't necessarily lead to notably high GDP growth than those European countries that do tax rich people way more than American. So probably his supply side economics wasn't necessarily successful. He also argued tax revenue would increase later as a result of economic growth. That didn't really happen, and so the deficit kind of expanded. But not only because of that, military spending was also increasing. He was like, he prioritized, increasing military. I think partly or mainly to combat Soviet Union. Uh, Recession also happened in the beginning of his term, 1981 to 1982. So that also shrink tax revenue because economic activity slows down, and automatic stabilizer such as unemployment benefits or I don't know Medicaid or other programs kind of automatically increase without government or Congress deciding. So so annual budget deficit grew from 2.7% of GDP to annual average of 4%. Quite a significant increase in uh, annual budget, right? So yeah, we can kind of tell that. So it was so in 1980 it was around 2%, my negative 2%. Deficit was 2% of GDP. Then it kind of expanded, right? So that's what happened. So his tax cut resulted in this, along with other things. And then next president was Republican president George H.W. Bush. He only served for 4 years because he couldn't get it reelected, mainly because of recession that happened during election year, I think. He did raise tax rates slightly because he was like, okay, maybe it's not a good idea that deficit is rising and national debt is surging. So he also adopted this policy, pay-go policy, which requires spending increase to match with decrease in other spending in other area, or tax increase, right? Which is, yeah, kind of like a smart idea in terms of making sure the deficit wouldn't surge. However, he also did make a lot of spending because his administration joined Gulf War against Iraq, so it was costly, right? The government needed to borrow a lot of money to fund the war or fund the government outlay. So annual budget deficit continued to be around 4%, not a significant improvement from Reagan years. Yeah, it was consistently high in this period. Maybe some improvement, not necessarily. And then recession happened here. Right, this dark color represent recession, so he couldn't get reelected in second term. And then who became president? Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton is known for his achievement of budget surplus. Okay, so he did raise income tax. Okay, raising income tax, which would increase tax revenue. He also lowered military expenditure. You could argue not necessarily because Bill Clinton did something amazing to achieve that happen. Cold War ended, okay, and like Bill Clinton didn't end Cold War. Cold War ended before his inauguration. However, because there is less intensive like uh, military tensions or diplomatic tension with superpower because Soviet Union collapsed. He didn't need to really expand military expenditure as relative to GDP. But he didn't necessarily cut military or shrink military. He just did probably lower the rate of increase in military budget, and GDP expanded, so military expenditure as relative to GDP probably shrank, and probably as relative to the total budget, I assume also decreased, which contributed to the achievement to in realization of budget surplus. Economy emerged from recession and continued expansion. Okay, so economy was constantly in a good shape. It was expanding. It didn't suffer from any recession throughout his term. So those factors combined, and he was able to have budget surplus, which was probably a good thing. So the total debt was decreasing at this time, and the debt as percentage of GDP also decreased, right? From 1991, and it kind of stabilized and it decreased. And this didn't continue. We got an ex-president, George W. Bush. Okay, first of all, he did suffer from recession. Okay, so budget deficit probably as a result. Well, let's start from the conclusion. The budget surplus ended and it went back to budget deficit. Recession happened in 2001. Early in his term, tax revenue shrank. Automatic stabilizer increased the government spending to address recession, and he also initiated a large tax cut, mainly benefiting rich people. He also increased military expenditure for wars. Remember, as a result of 9/11, he fought against Afghanistan. He also invaded Iraq. His administration probably needed to spend quite a lot of money while also reducing tax. So he did borrow a lot of money. The government did issue a lot of bond and fund the government's outlays. So the total debt almost reached 70% of GDP, right? Okay, so it was very consistently rising as percentage of GDP. Budget deficit is used to be surplus, but now it is deficit. And then we're gonna have this a sharp increase in budget deficit. It was Barack Obama who became the next president, and there was sharp decline in revenue due to Great Recession. Remember 2008 financial crisis, or well, technically, I think the recession itself started in December of 2007. It was one of the worst recession contraction the U.S. has suffered from. So obviously, tax revenue shrink, tax automatic stabilizer increase government spending and outlays and payment. He did to address this issue of Great Recession, to make sure Great Recession doesn't get as deep as Great Depression. He did sign American Rescue and Reinvestment Act. I think it was a massive fiscal package, paying making a lot of payment to unemployed individuals and other individuals, other benefits, extending other education and healthcare benefits, while also making a lot of contracts with private firms, purchasing a lot of things, increasing spending. It was very massive, and the military expenses also continued to be really high because the war with Iraq and Afghanistan, or at least I think the stationing of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan still continue. So annual deficit averaged around 8% of GDP in his first term. Let's look at this. So as percentage of GDP, see, very significant increase in budget deficit, and it continued to be very high throughout his first term for the reason that I stated. And deficit did increase, the total debt held by public, this is just debt as percentage of GDP, did rise, continue to rise until it stabilized here in his second term. So let's look at his second term. Second term, it fell to range of 2.5% to 4%, which is historically not extremely high, not the best, but kind of normal. And then the U.S. got another president, which is Donald Trump from Republican Party. He served his first term for 4 years, and he did sign a significant, huge tax cut. Again, mainly, he did reduce income tax for almost everyone. However, it was proportionally bigger tax cut for rich people, especially because corporate tax was reduced very significantly. I think it was somewhere around from 30 some percent to 20% or 21%. Very significant tax cut. So deficit rose to 4.6% of GDP by 2019 from 2 point some percent or 3% from Obama's era. We can tell this from this evidence. We can see the evidence here. 2000. Yeah, so it continued to rise throughout his Trump's first term, and then they got COVID recession. So COVID recession and pandemic relief. COVID recession contracted the economy, so tax revenue shrank. Automatic stabilizer increased government outlays and spending outlays, and also there was bipartisan pandemic relief, which did pay a lot of money, and also funded a lot of things. And deficit hit 14.9% of GDP. Okay, it's record high. It was I think it was as the only time that the U.S. Budget deficit exceeded this level was World War II. Okay, so it was World War II level. It was not as high as World War II, but it was very similar. I mean, there was no other incidents in the U.S. history that resulted in such a high budget deficit, as high as 14%. Okay, as percentage of GDP. 14% of GDP. And then we've got Joe Biden. As COVID pandemic ends, budget deficit did decline. Okay, we saw improvement here. Yeah, well, obviously it doesn't continue. We don't do this. We don't pay this pandemic relief every single year. Um, it is important they did that. I guess a lot of people were suffering from this, and some people got adverse effects of COVID. Effect unemployed individuals, people who lost houses, people who were not able to get enough healthcare. So many people were in trouble. So a lot of savers, especially rich people who are producing way more than what they're actually consuming, help the government pay for these things out of self-interest, not like their kind, as I explained. But it was probably important. This reallocation was probably smart. Of course, that probably, yeah, okay. Uh, However, that's not the only thing that happened. If you look at this budget deficit throughout Biden's administration, it's quite high, right? Well, it definitely become it improved from the COVID era, but it is emergency, right? So we can kind of tell that uh, this level is way actually higher than pre-pandemic level during Trump's administration. It was constantly around 5 to 6%. Yeah, it was never five really. It's always around 6% of GDP, right? The budget deficit, which is very high. Why did that happen? Partly because there was discretionary spending, including infrastructure project. Biden did focus on infrastructure project, although his infrastructure bill allocated funds throughout next 10 years from the point of passage. It did increase spending, I think. But not only that, interest payment also surged following interest spike in 2020. Uh, what I'm saying is that as a result of supply chain disruption, the inflation surged to like 7%, right? Very high in the US. And the Fed, the central bank, reacted to this by raising interest rate. They wanted to cool down the economy. They wanted to tell firms and households that they're buying too much, right? So they did increase interest rate. Uh, and as a result of this, uh, the new government bonds that the government issues in, for example, 2022 or 2023, that had to show higher interest rate. Remember, interest rate always follow each other. If you know, if one interest rate goes up, other interest rate often follows. So that's what happens. And federal, uh, what central bank in the U.S. kind of did is like they did open market sale. They bought, uh, sorry, they sold a lot of U.S. Treasury bond that they hold to the public, to different private firms, private banks. So banks paid for those things, right? Banks gave a lot of their cashes, their money uh, to Fed. So that kind of contracted the money supply, and when money supply decreases, interest rate surges. There's less money available, less money flowing in the loanable fund market. So that scarcity leads to difficulties for the government to get funding for their projects, to get money for deficit spending, right? And when that happens, they also have to raise the interest rate that or the yeah that the treasury securities yields. So because of this, probably what happened is interest payment in 2023 and 2024 had to be very high, and we have very clear evidence of this. Federal outlays interest as percent of gross domestic product. Okay, interest payment. So pre-pandemic level was here. Okay, pre-pandemic, during Obama and uh, Trump's administration. And then after COVID, it surged all the way to this, right? And this is what the government needed to be uh, paying, right? Remember, government need to pay back interest payment to whoever holds the U.S. Treasury securities, and Biden was the one who had to bear. Yeah, Biden was president at this time, therefore, deficit become high, and it was higher than the pre-pandemic level. So many reasons probably led to this. So this is it. Yeah, I basically explained the U.S. history of bond and all these things, but very very important. A lot of important ideas. So, and a lot of them are confusing. So make sure you know what's the problems and what's good things. And one of the things I want to re-emphasize is that borrowing is reallocation. It is not creation of resources. If borrowing happens, someone is giving up. When U.S. Uh, issued a lot of bond to fight against Japan and Germany, a lot of consumers were giving up consumption. And when COVID relief was given, some investment was given up, some consumption was given up. Yeah, and this may not be a problem, especially in like recession period like COVID, right? A lot of people are not buying anyway, so they have a lot of, they make saving anyway. So U.S. bond, buying U.S. bond wouldn't necessarily uh, be a well like buying U.S. bond would be good ideas because they don't want to spend anyways. They don't really have anything that they want to spend anyway. So that wouldn't, yeah, necessarily, I guess, rapidly increase the treasury interest rate. But yeah, there's so many different point of views, and yeah, that's it.